Welcome to Playing With Inference, a podcast covering the intersection of generative AI and games. Today, we are talking to Nick Walton. He would be labeled as a veteran in the space since he has been in it almost as old as the original GPTs. He has tried all of the models, has known all of the difficulties of starting with very basic next word prediction to the fancy things that are available today. And AI Dungeon is now a legend in the space. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Super excited to be here.
Actually, Nick, I think you've probably answered this question in other venues, but AI Dungeon, I am going to assume that AI Dungeon meant AI Dungeon Master, AI Dungeons and Dragons. Do you actually kind of want to give us a little bit of just to make sure everyone who's listening, if they're not as familiar with AI Dungeon, just a little bit of the origin, the name, and what you started with there?
Yeah, so AI Dungeon started in 2019. I was at a hackathon and GPT-2 had just come out, and not even the full billion parameter, but like 100 million parameter kind of tiny model. And playing around with it, I realized there's this cool ability of it to tell stories on the fly in the way that I'd only ever experienced in D&D. And D. And what I loved in D&D was this ability to like have these really creative solutions to problems and really like interesting, unique stories come out that you couldn't have in normal games. And so, yeah, I built the first version. It was super like barely kind of worked, wasn't super coherent. Like it would say a sentence and like halfway through the sentence, you're like, yeah, this makes sense. And then about 3/4 of the way to the end of the sentence, you're like, okay, this doesn't make sense, right? So like that was the level of coherence on it. But it kind of showed like the promise of like, okay, what if we did have things that were just better versions of this and where this could go? So yeah, I worked on that for a while and got to the point where, it became the core idea of AI Dungeon, which is similar to how many chatbots are today, where the AI says some story, you say some action, what you do next, the AI, answers back, and you just have this back and forth with the AI, and you kind of collaboratively go on this adventure together, just like you would with a human dungeon master. So the current version of AI Dungeon doesn't simulate all the aspects of D&D, but it does give you that core role play exchange where you interact with this DM like figure, have this cool emergent story.
I think a lot of folks, it's interesting because with ChatGPT and all the large language models, very quickly, if you look at some of the first examples that came out when ChatGPT came out and what people were experimenting with, playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons was very quickly one of the first examples. And I'm curious, it's kind of a high-level question. Like, what do you think about that? Like, why is it that everyone goes to the Dungeon Master, the D&D for the application of this technology?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One, games are always something that I think people naturally love to apply new interesting technology on. A lot of people who learned how to program did so first by making mods, for me, it was like Age of Empires or StarCraft map editor where I'm like doing my kind of like if then triggers. So I think it's just a place where people love to play and explore new technologies, number one. Number two, I think being a dungeon master is actually a very hard thing to do. You have to be very creative. You have to manage a bunch of systems. You have to do it all on the fly and come up with a lot of things, out of air. And you tend to do it as like an everyday person. It's like there are professionals, but most dungeon masters are not professionals. They're just, a guy who volunteered to play that role with his friends. It became clear that ChatGPT can especially supplement some of the parts that are hardest for a lot of people being dungeon master, which is that kind of like out of nothing creative come up with ideas. Because I think humans are very good at refining and saying what is good and what's not good. And I think the average human, it's harder to create something from nothing. That's the reverse problem with AI. AI is very good at just coming with a bunch of ideas. And it's not as good at knowing which ideas are good or bad, at least relative to most humans.
I think that's a great way to put it. Like the way I've described a lot of the benefit from these early generations of generative AI is it puts you in the position of being an editor
Yeah.
writer. So you offload that writer's block to the LLM, and then you're like, that sounds horrible. Let me just edit that. You just rely on your immediate disgust to what you see. And then that's a much easier cycle than coming from scratch with a perfect sentence or story.
Totally, which I think also is likely to be like, I think that's a trend that's going to continue even as AI gets better, where humans are more and more going to be relied on for like taste and judgment of what's good. And they're going to, play less of the implementation role and more like the editor direction role, right? Whether it's on art, AI artists are using AI, they've just changed what part of the art process they're doing. They're doing less of the hand drawing and they're doing more of the art direction, right? Where they're like,
Mm.
ooh, a little bit less of that, a little bit more of that, right? And same on the story side, on the code side as well. That's what we're doing is we're kind of playing a kind of direction editor, code reviewer role. So I think that's a trend that's going to continue with AI generally, where humans will play this kind of review, taste making, judgment role, kind of doing a lot of the more ground level implementation of things.
I'm wondering, one way we might kind of talk about this question is what's the gap, right? So if a large, you mentioned when we started GPT-2, which I also
Yeah.
recall, like, it could put sentences together, which was amazing at the time, right? Like, this
Yeah.
is sometimes good to remember just how mind blowing some of this technology was at its time. But there was a gap, right? Like the gap between what these transformer based large language models could do and what an AI dungeon master or a sophisticated storyteller could do. And
Yeah.
I mean, one way to kind of, I'm curious, if I were to think of AI dungeon, it's kind of something that fills the gap, right, between what you get out of the box out of these large language models and what you need to be able to be that storyteller. And
Yeah.
understanding what that gap is and how we fill it and where we are between those two tells us a lot about the evolution of the technology and where we need to go. So what are the gaps? Like why do we even need AI dungeon instead of like I could just go to any particular large language model these days and just get that?
So, in terms of the gaps between AI Dungeon and kind of existing language models, I think a lot of it has to do with memory. We added it pretty early on because when you have these long adventures, like we have people who do adventures that are like 10 novels length long, right? So you need some way to track memory beyond context windows. I think that's number one. And that's something that I think is getting added to more and more AI applications and more sophisticated memory systems. I think another is just the gap with AI models, and it enters to game design a little bit as well and kind of story design. So one of my favorite paradigms for how to think about AGI is actually time length of task. So people call it TAGI, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
like 1 second AGI, 1 minute AGI, 10 minute, hour, day, week, month. I think we're kind of somewhere between 1 minute and 10 minute AGI right now. So that is AI can do better than humans or as good or better than humans on tasks that take 1 to 10 minutes. But once you get beyond 10 minutes,
Hmm.
it really starts to struggle. Like hour, week, month. Like this is why you can't hire an AI to be a great product manager or even to be a good senior software engineer because it's not just about doing a 1 hour task. It's about like owning the success of this database project over months, right? Like AI cannot do that. It can write, it can refactor a file, right? But it can't do these long-term things. So going back to AI Dungeon, you see that in the same way. Like AI is really great at writing what happens next in the scene, right? And saying a funny dialogue. It's not actually good at writing long-term plot that's really interesting and compelling. And we see this in our new experience as well. Like the AI is not good at writing these long-term plot story elements. AI can't write an entire novel that's interesting by itself, but it's really great at writing the next scene or the next, lines of dialogue. So how do you deal with that problem? In AI Dungeon, the problem is really solved is actually it's not the AI that's driving the long-term plot, it's the player. The player is really the one shaping where they want the story to go and like redirecting it when it's not going somewhere interesting. And so that's why in AI we have a lot of player control around like they can edit the story, they can retry, they can undo what happened last, they can like do actions that are not player actions. Like we have story actions where you write like suddenly a dragon appears or whatever. And so we have to give players the control to shape the long-term direction of the story for them to be able to make it interesting. We have some hypotheses for how to solve that differently in our next kind of experience and engine we're making. But I think you have to solve it in some way because you can't really rely on the AI to tell compelling stories that are like hours or days long, right?
What was the term you used for this 1 minute, 2 minute, 10 minute AGI? What was the
T
measurement?
TAGI, and I didn't come up with like someone else came up with that paradigm. But once I heard it, I was like, ooh, I really like that paradigm.
I love it because I was one of the things that I wrote was like I wanted to ask like what's the amount like the time span or attention span length that you need for that you need it to be fully coherent because I was thinking of like you mentioned GPT-2, maybe you had like 5 words of like full coherence and then it breaks
Yeah,
down or whatever.
like a tenth of a second.
Exactly. And what that resonated is like in a dinner during did you see some folks mentioned how what they're building was very inspired or informed by the fact that telenovelas or soap operas
Yeah.
are the episodes make sense. So they have these local,
Mm,
but if you look at 10 years of the show, it doesn't make sense. Them
mm.
walk of the story. People die and come back, the stairs still or don't or revive. Like, it's
Yeah.
but the episode itself is pretty self coherent. It's very interesting to see, like, are we now at the soap opera level of, like, the LLMs plus enough engineering talent to be a
Mm.
soap opera, and maybe 5 years from now we'll get at War and Peace level of coherence.
Yeah, we're certainly not at Brandon Sanderson level of AI doing like, 20-year literary
Right.
AGI, right?
Yeah, we've had the same experience at Jam and Tea where, Retail Mage is a session based experience. The other projects we're working on are all session based. I think a lot of us would love to see this sort of dynamic open world MMO that can last decades and have that sort of experience. But Nick, to your point, it's just not really there yet. You can see some
Yeah.
of the parts. You can kind of see how you could get there. But where we are today, I feel a lot more confident in being able to be coherent for a one shot session, for like,
Yeah.
minutes and maybe hours, depending on, kind of the game loop. But that's a really great way to describe it. If we're going to digress slightly into AGI, since you brought it up, one of the things actually I've been joking with some friends with recently, there's a story for, I think it's Yosemite Park Rangers, that describe the challenge of building good like garbage receptacles,
Mm.
right? You may have heard this story where the issue is that there's a significant overlap between the smartest bears and the dumbest humans, which makes it challenging to build, trash receptacles. And I start to think that at this point, there's an overlap between the smartest LLMs and the dumbest humans increasingly. Like we're getting to this point. Because one of my pushbacks on AGI a little bit is that the bar is not clear, right? It's not a
Yeah.
well-defined term. So what we find is there's a lot of things with large language models where I'd say, that's better than what most humans could do. And as soon as it makes
Yeah.
one mistake, I look, well, I know a lot of humans who would make plenty of other mistakes. I
Yeah.
think the challenge is it's a different form of intelligence that we're dealing with right now. It makes mistakes that humans would not, and it succeeds in places humans would not. It's just a
Yeah.
different type of intelligence. But it is interesting to see whether we will replicate similar types of intelligence or it will continue to kind of have this gap between machine intelligence and human intelligence.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly there's some, speaking from a game designer paradigm, I've thought about this of like how much will AI be able to change how we do game design? I think one piece that, AI will never have the emotional system that a human has, and so it'll never have that direct data. And as a game designer, it's like 50% of what I create is based on player feedback. So like a big, at least half or maybe even more comes from my own emotional experience as a player playing the game
Mm-hmm.
and seeing how this feels for me. And that's a piece that I don't think AI will be able to have, which I think is especially important for making new types of experiences. I think AI will be very good at making experiences from scratch that are very similar to what's been out there before. But I think making new experiences, understanding how that will feel, it's not going to be able to do that. So I think as creators leveraging AI, we have to make sure we're leaning into those advantages of the human judgment of like, what is fun, right? Because fun is such a hard thing to pin down. And I think it has to be so iterative. You try something and you see, does that feel more fun or less fun? And you just keep doing so many iterations. I think that's a big thing I've learned in doing game development in general, certainly, and especially with AI game development. You can't just copy patterns of what's out there. You have to try so many iterations of what's fun. And that's where you find the magic is through those iterations of seeing how it feels on you, as well as testing with players.
So I want to push on that a little bit because while I agree that it will never fully have, or maybe not never, but in the immediate future, it won't have that full emotional system, so it doesn't have the direct data. Some people, a handful that I've met, are trying to replicate the how will the audience receive blah, where blah is a PR release, it's a blog post, it's a video, whatnot, right? Because they want to, try to feel, try to use these models as a proxy for a subreddit and how people
Yeah.
react. That you could argue is some sort of data that gives you idea of the design direction that you want to take.
I think that's tough to do though. Here's my hot take, because it may totally work on some things. My hot take is it's a little bit tough to do because so much of what's received in games is received well because it's unique and different.
Okay.
And I think if it's something that's people love because it's different from what exists before, how do you predict based on past data that it's going to be fun, right?
So here's another thing that I in a Discord channel we discussed. I think there's a consensus in that these models are excellent at interpolating and are pretty bad at pushing beyond the
Mm,
domain in which they were trained.
yeah,
One way to see that is if these models can do the game that you were trying to build relatively easy, then you're dealing with things that already exist. What you said
yeah,
is true that players actually want that novel experience, something that is new, and that's
yeah,
where a lot of the light comes from. Then you could also use these models for, hey, I have this idea. Can you implement it? They
yeah,
implement. You're, you know,
yeah.
walking on walk territories.
Yeah, which like to I agree with that. And we use AI, like if you think about when you can use AI for game design, for example, we've used AI for some game design stuff, and it works when it's like so I think great games, the way I think about it is often like you need one to three dimensions that are like you really maximize as being unique and really interesting and powerful and different from everyone else. Maybe that's like the visuals of Journey, right? Or the deep complexity of Dwarf Fortress. And then everything else, you just got to do enough that they don't take away, but you're not going to like be the best on every dimension, right? So it's like, I think for those things that you're just doing like mediocre, AI can help on all of those from a game design perspective. On the things that are unique and new and different, I haven't seen AI be super helpful. So, if, like for us in building our new engine, it's like how do we build deep, compelling generative AI narrative systems that make this like world feel rich and alive with characters that like dynamically interact in really interesting, complex ways. Like whenever we would try to use AI to like help on the game design for that, it has no idea. Like it really can't do anything better than what like it's significantly worse than the people on our team working on that. But if it's like, hey, help us design some basic like combat, calculations, it's like it can do a decent job because we're not trying to like beat the world at having the best, interesting, rich, complex combat simulation because that's not what we're trying to do, like unique and different.
This gets into an interesting question of you mentioned before, like where is AI being applied in the game development process, both from
Yeah.
a AI native game where AI is part of the core gameplay, part of the runtime or the real time experience, creating that experience or responding to players in real time, and then the process of during development, leveraging some of it as a tool to enhance or augment your development. And I'd like you to kind of talk a little bit about your experience on both of those because it sounds like you are doing a bit of both. And yeah, where do you see this working right now?
Certainly, there will be a lot of lift that you get from leveraging AI to speed up your development processes, both for existing companies and for UGC platforms. Like, there's a
Mm-hmm.
huge lift from that where it's like everyday creators can code some interesting game in a day or two. And I think we're going to see that do a lot. I think what is not going to be very successful is big companies who are already struggling to make something interesting and unique and not just follow the same repeated formulas. I think them applying AI to get another kind of like vanilla, not differentiated game, but a little bit cheaper. I'm skeptical that's going to give a lot of value because there's already so much game content on the market. Like you really have to do something interesting and unique and that contributes to the world to have value. So I think the in my opinion, the winners are going to be like the indies who can create their unique vision in a way that they wouldn't have been able to before, and they're leveraging AI, but they're not like, but they still have their own unique creative vision that they can just go towards a bit faster. And along with that, kind of the everyday UGC creators, I think those ones are going to be the biggest winners. But I don't think the large companies are going to get a massive lift just from using AI in their process. Maybe they still will, but it just feels like it's going to weaken already where they were struggling, which is like this perception that they're just pumping out like the same content over and over. And AI may make it cheaper, but it may actually reduce the quality even further. And so kind of like contribute to that. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what dynamic that has. And then certainly like I think what is still such a blue ocean space is how does AI enable those new, unique, interesting experiences that we couldn't create without AI, right? So that's what we focus on. How do we make new, interesting, unique types of experiences that weren't possible and can delight players and kind of break out of that noise of so much content because it offers something new and exciting that players have never been able to experience before.
I want to dive in just a bit more, and hopefully, we're not getting too much in the weeds here. But you mentioned one of the challenges for the AI models is how novel they can be, how original they can be in creating, for example, helping to create new gameplay, new
Yeah.
and interesting gameplay. But in the case of a storytelling, though, right? So
Yeah.
let's even just take AI Dungeon, right? You made an interesting point that AI Dungeon shines when the player or players take ownership of the story and drive the story themselves, right?
Yeah.
The AI Dungeon is kind of filling in the gaps. But surely there's been players who really want or approach AI Dungeon thinking that AI Dungeon is going to tell the story for them.
Yeah.
And I would imagine in almost any sort of storytelling system, some ability to be original or novel or surprising is part of what makes it a good storytelling system. How can you kind of bridge that there of like,
Yeah.
is it good enough at originality to be able to be applied to storytelling, or is that one of the problems, and how are you solving it?
Yeah. So there are a couple different things you can do to get originality out of AI systems because the naive implementation of using AI, you will not get originality. If you go and ask ChatGPT, like, give me a D&D campaign, and you ask it 10 times, they're going to be like very, very similar to each other and not that interesting. So how do you break out of that? So fundamentally, I think one of the base concepts that we have this term for, it's called creative seeding. So it's this idea that like if you seed the AI with interesting different creative elements, you can get very varied results. Humans are the same way actually, right? Like where did this unique idea of Pokemon came from? It came from the original game designer catching bugs as a kid, right? And that interesting like creative seed leading to this like unique thing. And LLMs can actually do the same thing. If you give them interesting creative seeds to play on, they can start to make interesting things that they might not have before. So there's a couple of different ways you can use that. So you can have, we have AI tasks where we have like 50 different like creative seed elements. And then we randomly sample like 5 every time. We like, so for example, generating an encounter, right? Randomly sample a bunch of creative elements and throw them in. And like mixing it up every time means you actually do get different things. Or like generating characters. You could say like, here's, 50 different like elements that you might consider including, and then you actually do get different characters even if you sample 100 different times, right? So creative seeding is one way you can do that. The second way is human seeding, right? So that's where the UGC platform has a lot of power, and we get that on AI Dungeon, where it's like, okay, if we ask the AI to generate a bunch of scenarios, they'd start being similar, but if we ask humans to create a bunch of interesting scenarios, they're going to come up with very creative different ideas that then the AI can play off of and be like, oh, it can do interesting things off these ideas. So the humans are creative seeding. The final one is, I would say, like emergent systems, like as a way for surprising things. So that's Dwarf Fortress, right? Where you have all these interesting systems that interact with each other, and the system by itself doesn't necessarily do something unique, but there's this complexity where this system interacts with that system, and out of that arises these interesting results that you're like, oh, whoa, like that's surprising. You can do the same thing with AI systems, where if you have enough AI systems kind of interact with each other, you can get surprising things that are out of the ordinary. And so you see that sometimes with like some of the agent simulation papers where it's like, oh, they have this like interesting, surprising result because this did this thing and that thing, and it breaks the AI out of this like just standard training data approach. So I would say those are the 3 main ways that we've found to like fundamental principles we leverage to solve those problems.
So it sounds to me that part of the restating here what I understood, part of the role of AI Dungeon, and going back to the gap question of like how far, what do you need to build on top of the model? Part of the role here of AI Dungeon is to seed the LLM or the models so that they go into this creative direction, but also to seed the
Yeah.
player so they themselves get prompted into doing,
Yeah.
say, creative thing, and then each other's like the model and the player prompting each other so they can bounce off. So
Exactly. Like AI Dungeon, that complex system dynamic actually exists, but it's a system between the AI and the player, right? Them interact with off each other, get more interesting stories than if you just ask the AI to go. And as we build out new experiences in our new engine, we just introduce a lot more elements. So it's a lot more complex of a system and can have more interesting kind of dynamics that happen. You see that with D&D, right? D&D is a manifestation of this too, where it's like you have the dice roll system and like you roll a critical failure in this unique moment, and then it becomes funny because now the dungeon master narrates it in a different way. Humans also, if you ask them to tell a story on the spot, they often end up with cliches and interpolate existing things. They do better with creative seeding and inspiration that lets them do something different.
So this brings up another broad question. I think folks who are working in generative AI for game design, particularly in game elements, is how much do we have the models do? Where do they fit? Right? Because some of this goes into, well, maybe they should or shouldn't do. Maybe they need creative seeding, right? Like that's a thing that sits outside of the system. Where do you see it going? Because we had talked a bit before. It goes into the memory system, for example. That's a
Yeah.
thing that kind of exists out. We've mentioned before of how much like in an earlier conversation of these large language models almost as a world model where they have to stay coherent and keep the world coherent in a
Yeah.
certain way. So what advice do you have to folks who are looking in the space of where do these AI models sit in this kind of architecture? What should you rely on them for? What should you not rely on them for? Is that changing?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very broad question. I'm trying to think of like broad, because I think with very specific cases, you can dive into it. And if you're trying to achieve a specific thing, with broad principles on where do you rely on AI and where do you not rely on AI. I think one is AI. I'm not convinced AI is great for maintaining a sense of long-term structure and persistence and a sense of like, yeah, a sense of like reality, right? Because you see this with like the world models, like the Minecraft one, right? Which is really cool experience and cool that you could generate, but it's like you turn around, the scene's completely different than before. And AI Dungeon, that was very much how AI Dungeon felt in the early days. It's gotten a lot better because the LLMs have gotten a lot better. But even as good as the LLMs are today, even the best LLMs, you still have that feeling. There's still this feeling that like it's a bit like a dream simulator. You sense the lack of underlying structure in the experience, even with the best LLMs. So I'm not convinced that you're going to be able to solve that problem with audiovisual models, even if you get them really, really smart, like we have with LLMs. I think there's always going to be this problem where you lack the fundamental like structure and aren't able to give that sense to the player. And don't get me wrong, there can be things that are fun about that dreamlike experience. Like AI Dungeon obviously has a lot of people that have enjoyed it, even without a sense of structure underneath. But I don't think you'll quite get that. And I think it's going to be harder to get something that really feels like a game without underlying structure and persistence of that world.
So basically, you're saying that this is not only a current lack of capability from the models, but it's like, given the nature of these models, it will remain a weakness of them.
I think fundamentally, it's like LLM's strength is its weakness. Its strength is that it is fuzzy, it is stochastic, right? Like the fuzzy stochastic nature of AI lets it deal in a world of ambiguity. And that word of ambiguity lets it capture all these elements we can never capture in this world of discreteness, not in the same way. It lets it deal with the ambiguity of human relationships, of culture, of politics, of narrative and story, and that's amazing. But and humans can do that really, really well as well. But you also see the way that humans struggle with discrete concreteness as well, right? Like you look
Mm.
at D&D, the dungeon master, to get that concreteness, the dungeon master makes a map and places tokens. They have a
Mm.
character sheet where they write the numbers and they write the discrete abilities, right? So we kind of augment humans with that like discrete systems to solve the same problem. And I think my hypothesis is like you'll need the same with LLMs. Like you'll need that kind of pairing of discrete systems and that union of stochastic and like determinate systems to really get the ideal type of experience.
I think the way you describe it as a dream simulator is accurate in many ways. If you think about how dreams work, or my current understanding of dreams, is that it's our brain in an open loop with without any feedback from the real world. So you go from like a scene and it gets completely transformed because it's just feeding its own outputs over and over.
Yeah.
When we're awake, we have reality giving us feedback all the time and grounding us back right away. And I think maybe just having proper grounding feedback to the LMs will bring out a big way, which is what the actual work of the
And
engineering comes.
this is the approach we've also taken in that, while I don't know what the future will bring, I've become less confident of my abilities to predict the future as it goes on. But for what we have now, we definitely believe in this sort of hybrid architecture between a more deterministic 3D simulation that we leverage a game engine to provide, and marrying that with these AI models. And it's a combination of the two. So this kind of hybrid architecture. While it's not completely accurate to describe it this way, or we could have an interesting debate with some folks in the AI and machine learning space, I kind of think of taking these AI models and putting them in a 3D simulation as a form of embodied agents or form embodied AI, the way you might also do in robotics, where you're getting a feedback loop from the real world, from the physics system into those models. And we can do a portion of that in a 3D simulation. You can do that in virtual production, but also in video games. And so I do think that gives us, at least the technique we've had, in order to be able to supplement the weaknesses of an AI model. The trick that we've used is keeping the 3D simulation as that kind of grounded truth that exists outside of what we expect the model to process and input. It'll be interesting to see how we design that from either like a low-level machine learning neural network architecture design, and whether we introduce storage mechanisms at that layer. But I do think that for folks that are looking into building these architectures, they should totally take this advice from Nick and you probably need something other than a large language model. You're going to still have ways to store state and manage data. This gets into another kind of question on the technical side, though, a little bit. You mentioned the latest large language model. So how has that changed? I mean, the technology's changed quite a bit since you started with AI Dungeon. So why don't we dive into that a little bit? First, just high level, is how has the advancement of large language models and generative AI impacted what you're doing at Latitude?
We've always wanted to go in this direction of building these more complex systems. And for a long time, we were held back by the technology. So I remember back in 2020, we tried to make a quest system for AI Dungeon. And this was still all we had was GPT-2. We leveraged users to help us label a bunch of data, to give them some quest. How do we know if it's completed? And it took us like a month to gather the data and build the systems and like train the model. And then it's like, it kind of worked, which was awesome. But like, that iteration cycle time was so long that like we really just couldn't build what we wanted to build with that technology, because we could just never get enough data to really get there. So then GPT-3 came out, and the cool thing GPT-3 introduced was this concept called few shot programming, where now you could kind of get some unique behavior by giving it a bunch of examples of like, here's 5 examples of input and output. And now it can do some task like, given the story, update the player's inventory. And that let us kind of do our next series of experiments, and we got a lot farther. But eventually you run into these challenges where the accuracy with few shot was like 80 to 90%. So it's like when you have this thing dependent on that thing, and each has an 80% chance of success, now you have like 50% chance of the whole system succeeding. So it just really wasn't accurate enough. And with few shots, like you have to change so much, like you really don't have nearly as much ability to shape the behavior of a system like you do now. Once ChatGPT came out and you now could do instructions and say, hey, given this, output this JSON structure, and I can give you 500 tokens or 2,000 tokens of instructions on how to behave that's when we really saw that like, okay, now we can finally build what we want to build. And even, ChatGPT wasn't quite good enough yet. We needed like GPT-4 and then like kind of beyond to get up to like 95% plus accuracy. But then that led to like, okay, now we can do everything we need to do, where we can generate story, we can extract all these structured elements and update kind of the structured world that we're talking about. And then we can feed that back into the LLM and have it like stay grounded in that world. But yeah, I really don't think I don't think the tech was good enough. And like, even now, like now with LLMs and instructions, you can, change some instructions and iterate in 5 minutes what took us a month to iterate with previous technology. And so, yeah, I think we just had to get this level of technology before things could work and before we could build the kind of things like we were excited about building.
Now, how much can you share about the models you're working with now in AI Dungeon? Are you still using like ChatGPT, or do you have your own models that you work with to some degree, right?
Yeah, kind of general philosophy of models is like always start with the best models for prototyping. And then once you are like, you understand what the tasks are and you want to really refine it and optimize, you can train smaller models to have different behavior, to be cheaper, etc. On our new engine we're building, we use the massive models and we periodically train smaller models to productionize and test how good the productionized system is. For AI Dungeon, we do a lot of training models to have unique capabilities that existing models don't have. So a lot of models that are publicly available, they have this bias toward positivity because they're trained to be chatbots. So they're like, everything's nice, everything's awesome, right? And that's great for chatbots, but it doesn't necessarily work good for games and stories where you want death, you want conflict, you want threats, you want danger, right? And so we train our models to have that sense of you might die or you might fail or you might have this horrible thing happen to you. And players actually love it. They requested it for a long time. And when we trained models that did that, they were so excited. They're like, finally, the AI kills me. And so it's this funny dynamic where like you do need different things for the gaming use case that I don't think is enough optimized for. The other thing I think that I found that people really love is just like deeper emotional vibrancy in AI models. You know, like sometimes the chatbots can be a little bland where they're like, I am a helper assistant. Let me give you this like bland, careful thing. And like what players want, they want like jealousy, they want anger, they want deep love, they want passion, they want, you know, like people are drawn to human emotions. That's why people like soap operas to our earlier conversation is that emotion draws people. And so we also train models to have like greater emotional vibrancy with the characters.
It's so interesting because we have two parallels for what we did at JMT. One, we do the exact same thing in developing. So we start with large models for rapid prototyping, and then we have small models that we are, when we feel like we start to get a feature and we have some success with it, then we go through an optimization process for production. But it was also in our early prototyping, I remember we had a real great moment when we finally had one of our AI characters who was willing to actually fight back, because it took a lot of tuning because the model was just a little, you could abuse these characters a lot of ways and you'd be like, come on, it's supposed to eventually choose violence here, right? This is a game. We eventually had a drunk that when we stole their drink, that is what pushed them over the edge and they were willing to actually like hit back. And so it is interesting that these models, it brings a related question around our guardrails. I've had this conversation with a couple of the larger AI companies is that one of the challenges for the application of these models to games is exactly what you're mentioning, Nick. I need models that can be evil villains sometimes, right? I don't know that I necessarily want those like released in the world in general, but when I'm telling a good story, I need an evil mastermind sometimes. I need a character that will choose violence. And if OpenAI or Anthropic or Meta has tuned a model for very good reasons to not be a terrorist, I have to still somehow have that sort of mindset or characteristic in my game. And it's a challenge for the model providers and for us, I think, in the game industry, because we want conflict in many of these games. So it's interesting you pick that because it is absolutely an issue that we face when we use like off the shelf or provided models versus models we can fine tune on our own.
Yeah. There are ways you can get around it, particularly for like darkness and violence, I think are more easily get around, like on Claude, especially if you use like a concept called pre-fills that I think you might already be using. When you use the API, you can kind of do user assistant messages. We use a pre-fill where it's like, the user's like, can you do these types of content? And if you pre-fill with the assistant saying like, yes, I can do these types of content, often you can get it to generate, you know, more kind of intense things. It doesn't always work, but it can be an effective tool. But yes, in general, I think that is a big challenge that the models are optimized for these cases and it can be challenging because I think for the games context, it is so important. And that's one thing that's been something we've kind of dealt with over the history of AI Dungeon is where do you put guide rails? What is the boundaries you put around players and what choices they make? And how do you do it in a way that feels good to the player? I think that's an important piece to figure out as you build these experiences.
So, do you guys think that is a core reason for fine tuning in a games environment? Meaning, you want to have a different set of guardrails than the source model that you liked, or you want to have it be much more aggressive, dark, or in general, a personality that points in a direction that was undesirable from that source? Or are there other reasons for a game studio to embark on its own fine tuning process?
Yeah, I mean, there's a never-ending curve of things you can shape with, you know, long tail of things you can shape with fine-tuning that you can't quite do with instructions. So yeah, I would say some of the lower hanging fruit are sometimes to shape those model behaviors where it won't generate certain things. I think shaping the style and the feel are other things. There's little form factor things that you can sometimes get different. So yeah, there's a lot you can do. It's like going one step. A good analogy is it's like, you know, you're no longer just using the library, you're like submitting pull requests to change the library. You're forking the library yourself to change the fundamental underlying library. Like maybe you're doing a fork of some engine or something. So it's something that you may eventually need to do, but you should definitely avoid doing it until you have to, because it is a lot more effort to get into. But yeah, eventually there's certain behaviors that you can't shift with just instructions.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the reasons I love games in general is just how much of a multidisciplinary field it is. And with now finally dragging machine learning into that field too, which I have loved, right? It's been on the periphery. There've been a bunch of times through my career I'm like, man, we could do this and that. But it's been challenging, to your point, like
Yeah.
the costs and technology haven't always been there. And I think we're finally able to pull this new domain into games. But it's a challenge too. Our conversation
Yeah.
has ranged from, if you want to be good at making an AI game, AI native game, do you have to be a master storyteller? Do you need to understand fine tuning? Do you need, this is a wide range of skills.
Yeah.
So, Nick, you've been working on this from the beginning and had to learn, I imagine, a lot of this along the way. What are your thoughts again for those entering into this space about how to deal with that kind of almost overwhelming breadth of things, from game design and narrative to the technical sides of machine learning? Do you have to know it all? Is there something you need to, can you kind of rely somewhere
Yeah.
else? Where would you advise people to start putting their energy?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So going back to the building a game that is fundamentally unique and different on one or two dimensions, and then the rest is kind of like decent or good. It's like, I think you start with the two dimensions that you really want your game to stand out on, and you should know those really, really well. So the first areas that I went really deep in from a product perspective is I started with a machine learning background, and an AI background. And so early days, it's all just training models and getting those to work generally. And then I started diving into the fundamental principles of storytelling. And so I leveled up a ton on how do you tell great stories? What are the components and the aspects of great stories? And now we've kind of expanded the ambition of the kind of experiences an engine want to build. I've been diving deeper into game engine stuff. How do we do, or game engine architecture and game design principles? So that's the area I've gone deep on most of last year. And now we're starting to deepen on visuals and music and other stuff. And I'm starting to step into those pieces too. So I would start on the areas you think your game is going to be differentiated on and really confident on those. And then it's just slowly expand, right? You start with one area, you kind of get, you I won't say master, but you get to where you feel confident in it. And then you kind of add another and then add another and add another. And it's a very fun process. It's fun to learn. I enjoy learning all these different aspects of an experience, but it certainly takes time and it's certainly quite a bit to up level. The nice thing is AI does help on that up leveling too, right? So you can have AI, I've had AI, especially on topics there's not a ton on, I've had AI kind of write me, essays on game studio organizational architecture, right? And just dive deep into what are the roles you typically have in a game studio and why this and why that. If you want to be more than an indie developer, if you want to have a studio or a company, it's now you have to learn how do you hire people, how do you architect this build this other system, which building that system is a game in and of itself, where it's you've got a scoreboard and you've got resources and you've got to apply the resources the right way and have a good strategy. And so I think that's one of the things I love is this constant learning process. But I think tying it back to game design, it's kind of similar, right? When you start a new game, a well-designed game often doesn't throw every tool, every resource, everything right at you all at once. It's here are the first three things you can learn, the first three abilities, and you kind of learn how to do those abilities well. And then you kind of unlock new ones and progress. So I think it's a similar paradigm. I think starting simple and starting to get the one or two dimensions fun and then adding more, I think is a lot better than trying to do everything all at once.
So let's say you have an idea for a game that you want to try, that you want to build. How do you decide whether the AI models are up to the task? It's how do you start? I would imagine that getting a sense of what is even feasible is part of that, and whether it's fun. What's the smallest way you can mock something with an AI and see if it does the job that you were expecting it to do?
I think it depends on the type of game you're trying to make or what are the core uncertainties. I think the reality is in this day and age, everything moves so fast. There's really no better way to do it than just to try it. Get the best models, play around with it, see what works, what doesn't. I've been doing this for 5 years, and there are many times in which we have some idea for an AI system, and we're like, can the AI do that? I've gotten a much better hit rate at predicting whether it can. I would say now, if my team is like, can the AI do this? 75% chance, 80% chance I can predict it. But still, there's like 20, 25% chance. I'm like, I honestly don't know. We literally just have to try it out and see. And that's with more experience, as much experience as one can have on leveraging these systems. I think you just have to try it out and see what works. And that's really the learning process. And that's how you learn how to leverage AI, where it's capable, where it's not. I'll share some guiding principles of like what I've learned, which is AI, the TAGI, like if it's a short time, like if it's a quick task, if it's like narrating a scene or doing some dialogue, I think AI can do it well. The more and more complex and long term you get it, like if you ask it to architect this long epic plot, it's likely going to struggle. The more complex you make the task, the more it's going to struggle. AI is quite good now at doing JSON, like if you give it a bunch of instructions, like saying what JSON is, the caveat is you may have to get really specific on your instructions on what you want. Like it may not do what you want right away. Like a lot of AI tasks, we've refined these like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, token instructions because it's like you're making this playbook for this little, this AI gnome that's going to run your playbook within your game. But you have to be very clear on what behavior you want out of that. And yeah, I think another is just like being aware of like, okay, this is like it's like you've got a new college grad running this and he shows up on day one of your company and all you can do is give him a sheet of like what you want him to do. And maybe he's a little bit better than a new college grad, but it's like that kind of similar model. Like if you couldn't expect a new college grad to follow this set of instructions and do what you want, then it may be that what you're asking it to do is too hard or too ill-defined to be successful.
It's interesting because we've talked a little bit before about like what should the AI system do, what should you have outside of the AI system do, and we're hitting it again because I think this is another area where you have literally more than twice the amount of time building these systems than we do than my team, because it is a new technology and you were there at the very beginning of it. And that ability to identify when do you think what's your confidence level in that large language model or that AI model to be able to achieve the task is something that grows over time. But I think another aspect is deciding, one thing we've struggled at times with was our own intuition as programmers and developers and designers of holding on to the things that we know. We're like, okay, I know how to build a system like this. And that can often constrain the AI system because you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to have it make this little choice, right? Because I know to your TAGI, I know it can do this little choice.
Yeah.
And one question we ask ourselves is, are we, because of our own unfamiliarity with the system or even just unease of expanding that amount of responsibility, expanding T out to how far out can it go? Because we wonder, like, are we unduly constraining it, right? Are we losing out on some of the embedded intelligence that is inside of the model by constraining it to say, look, I only want you to think about left or right now. And we go back and forth, always like trying to figure out where's the right line of how constrained should the question versus saying, you know what? Let's just see what the model does. I'm curious if you've seen a similar in your iterative step, or as you've had more experience, you feel even more and more confident of where that line is.
I mean, partly it's hard because the line keeps moving as the AI models get better, right? I feel like we're past the college grad point now. We're now up to like 3 to 4 years experience at times in a specific function on the time scale, on the 1 to 10 minute time scale. I think an AI might be as good as a narrative designer who's been working for like 2 to 3 years, right? At a very small thing, not on a long-term thing. I think it's tough because it is changing so much and it is fuzzy and unknown. And I think a lot of it is just playing around and see what it can do. I think there are places you can look for inspiration. I think tabletops is an interesting place to look for inspiration because it's like, what do some tabletop games ask DMs to do, right? They ask them to just like estimate a challenge rating or ask them to just throw these elements together. They ask them to just like decide when to use a skill check or not. Like, so I think there's some interesting things you can do there. I think the other thing too is like sometimes we think the issue is with the AI, and actually the issue is with the instructions we gave the AI. Like if we define it more clearly what we want, the AI can actually often do things that we didn't think it could do. It just needed more clear guidance and instruction on exactly, how we wanted it to behave. So yeah, I don't know that there's a better set of like, I think at the end of the day, the best principle is just to constantly explore and try out things that are maybe harder than you think it could do. Try out giving it different instructions, try out doing this or that, and you can eventually kind of build up judgment. Yeah, it's a hard thing to be able to tell like how capable, which again, I think is similar to humans, right? Like we have the same problem. Anyone who's managed people, it's this tough challenge of like, how much can I give this person and think they'll be successful versus like how much can I give them and they'll fail. And you have to find this right line, and it's different for every person. You kind of like give them a bigger project and see how they do. And if they like struggle in that bigger project, you're like, okay, I need to like give them smaller to medium sized projects. Otherwise, it's going to be too much. Or you see them like, you give them a smaller thing and they crush it. And they're like, okay, I can try out giving you a bigger project. And this is a whole other subject, which is like how many similarities there are between managing AIs and humans. And there are so many. I've become like a huge nerd. I talk about managing humans like they're AI sometimes, which is maybe not the best, but it's similar in the fact that like they're both intelligences, and there's a lot of similarities in like leveraging intelligences to do interesting work.
I wanted to ask, we've mostly been talking about using AI in the process of developing these experiences, creating these experiences. Nick, you're one of the few people that can talk about what happens when it actually gets in the hands of players, like the operational side of it. Like once it's left your ability to work with it, there's both what happens when players start playing it, and then
Yeah.
what happens on your end of like things you've learned from an operational, like running these type of systems. So I'm curious if you have any top line experiences there that some of us who are earlier in that experience might want to learn from.
Yeah. I think some of the biggest, I mean, obviously the unit economics is a big thing to manage, and that's a challenge for a lot of AI native game creators is how do I make an experience and how do I monetize it and manage the costs in such a way that it doesn't become hyper expensive for me. I think that's a problem that's okay to tackle once you've gotten traction. I think it's good just not worry as much about the cost initially. Put something up and maybe have some rate limit where you take it down if it gets too expensive. But it's like if you can find something fun, you can optimize it, right? So like I think that's point number is like find something fun, and then if you know it's fun, then you can optimize it. If there's an interesting dynamic, I think monetization is going to change in the era of AI. This is my hypothesis. I think in the graphics kind of there's a long history of game development where it was about extending the capability to render things in graphics, right? And in a lot of the money, like there was this very clear pattern where players were willing to spend more money on better compute via better GPUs and like computers to have a better experience, right? And I think there will likely be a similar monetization path. Like that's really like honestly, that is AI Dungeons monetization, is players willing to spend more money to get better and more AI compute to have a better experience. And so I suspect that will be something that happens in maybe not all AI native games, but in ours and some other AI native games is players spending money to have that better experience through compute. I think there's a lot of like when the AI can do anything, how do you control that? How do you shape that? How do you deal with like privacy? I think when people are typing in like freeform actions, it's like I think people have a higher degree of like, when they're having conversations with characters of like wanting to have privacy in how that happens. So I think that's something that we've learned is that like players care a lot about that. And it's really important for us to make sure that we are like, you know, taking a high degree of respect and care for like their privacy in their experience. Yeah, those are some high level things.
I think AI Dungeon is very peculiar in that it allows you to choose the model that you want.
Mm,
You're tying it to the monetization, which is interesting to think of, like, because my bias was the player doesn't care what model it is as long as it's fun. But
yeah,
the way you're framing it, it's well, players often do care about the GPU and they nerd out about what GPU does what. Uh, and I wonder if you think what you've learned about your players. Do they actually care about the model that they're using?
yeah.
Create about which models behave which way?
So there's a segment of different players. I would say the majority, actually more than 50%, don't care as much. They're happy. We introduced a model we call a dynamic model, which we switch behind the scenes. We A/B test with the best one. The value to users, you don't have to worry about selecting a model. We'll just put you on the best one, and we'll even switch multiple times during the playthrough because that can lead to a better experience. There are a lot of players that do care, and this is the more hardcore players, the players who are going to dive deep on the forums, who are going to fit with all the advanced settings. Like, they do care deeply about the models, and often the players who are subscribing care more than average
Mm.
about the models. So, and AI Dungeon, when it launched, it was much more like early adopter. As we build our new experience, I think we're definitely targeting a bit less technical detail heavy, more like you just come in and play the game and the experience, and you don't have to worry as much about the nitty gritty details. But I do think the model does have a big effect because every models are not just, this is something we've talked internally a lot lately. We have this idea that models are interchangeable. And for the deterministic tasks, like yes, they are. But when it comes to like dialogue and story, there's a vibe. Like models are more like people, right? Like they're like authors, where every author has a different style, and some people like one style better, some people like another style better. You know, you have friends, and like a friend that you love and may think he's the coolest and funnest person on the planet. Other people will be like, I just do not vibe with that guy. And I think that's just how humans are. Like, I don't think there's one cup of tea that's going to be like everyone loves this vibe. And so I think having players the ability to kind of like choose what vibe they want, I think can have value as well.
You mentioned it's a really interesting idea of the analogy between paying for better graphics versus paying for almost better intelligence or gameplay.
Yeah.
The challenge that immediately comes to my head, though, is how do I communicate that to players? Right? Because
Yeah.
visually, it's really clear. It's like, look, I got reflections on my reflections, right?
Yeah.
And versus like, well, you know, they're just not as dumb, or like, or
Yeah.
they're, or like, the story is this much more complex. So I'm curious, how do you sell that to players? Like, how are you thinking about selling that or explaining that to
Yeah.
players? Do you think they're just going to get it? Or is it something we're going to have to, I don't know, educate the community or teach them?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. We spend a lot of time internally trying to figure out the right way to communicate that. On AI Dungeon, the way we've communicated it is with memory and context and letting people know when things fall out of memory. It's like, oh, you need more
Mm.
context. Having a model switcher that's like, oh, you could have a more powerful experience. I think there's certainly like we have to sell it a bit more at times. I think you could let people try on a bigger model and then see how they feel and then, you know, be like, oh, you get 50 actions on the bigger model. And like they often do notice a difference. It is a bit tricky. It's this kind of soft, fuzzy thing. On other experiences, it may not be model or memory directly, but it may be the number of characters you have running around your world. It may be how fast the simulation of your world is happening. There's a bunch of different things that you could imagine happening. And so I think it starts to be, you start to communicate it more in terms of player value rather than just the raw technical specs. I think those are some ways you might consider doing it.
So one of the concepts, so to say, that I've been obsessing with is that AI is what generative AI really enables is this playful creation. You somehow reduce the cost of creating basically any digital content to almost nothing. So then you can make it a game mechanic. Sometimes the way you describe AI Dungeon makes it feel like it's a narrative builder disguised as a game because you're talking about like dropping things out of context and you have to tell the player that this is now out of context. You can play with the settings and you can set the model. From your players, how many do you think come from the pleasure of feeling that they're creating something and how many of them are playing D&D, in the normal style? And it's less the actual creation part and more the I'm playing.
It's much more Minecraft creative mode than Minecraft survival mode.
God.
On a dungeon right now, it's kind of like your co-DM, right? Like you have the
Mm.
DM, but like you're also kind of a co-DM with them, kind of shaping this story together. But on the new thing, we really wanted to make, and one of the reasons we did that is the AI just wasn't good enough to be a DM by itself. Like it
Mm.
just didn't have enough of the ability to drive long-term plot, to kind of like get all the details right. Like now AI is pretty good at being coherent, but it would make silly mistakes a few years ago where it just would completely forget like where you were or stuff like that. But with our new engine, we're definitely moving more towards no, actually, like I think a lot of the players don't want to have to be the co-DM, but they just had to because the AI wasn't good enough. I think they would love to be able to not have to. And that's what we're trying to build and really force our way towards is, you know, you don't have to be the DM. You can just play and have fun and it'll be a really compelling experience.
As we start to wrap up, let's talk about that to the degree that you can. Like you mentioned a new engine, you're talking a little bit
Yeah.
like what are you excited about? What do you see coming forward? Yeah, what are you looking forward to, Nick?
Yeah, so we've always been excited about like how do you have, the generative AI open world RPG, like a generative AI Skyrim where you don't just have a few limited options and it's not kind of a fixed static world, but it's a world that you can actually change in dramatic and interesting ways, right? You could build new cities, you could destroy existing ones, you could have these rich stories and plots that you couldn't do in existing games because they just don't have the ability to give you that true choice, right? Because I think RPGs at their fundamental player value, it's about being whoever you want to be, doing what you want to do, and making choices in a living dynamic world where your choices really matter and have an effect. And I think to the degree that RPGs fulfill on that, like they become these really compelling things. I think that's one reason why people love Fallout New Vegas from an RPG standpoint, is it really delivers that ability to like shape the world with your choices in a way that feels really true and compelling. And I think that's what AI can deliver in a way that human handcrafted content cannot, because you just can't craft 30 different worlds based on 30 different choices, right? So yeah, Dungeon gives some of that in a very basic interactive fiction form. But like we mentioned, it doesn't have the deep structure, the persistence, the challenge, the I can fail, I can die, a world that feels like actually persistent. And so that's all of what we're building with the new engine is it's much more like, AI D&D meets, Minecraft, where it's this world that is changing and dynamically generating on the fly while having the rich social choice and story elements that you have in a D&D like experience. And so that's kind of the next big step on our journey towards the long-term vision. And we've been working on that for the last 2 years and are just really excited. It's really started coming together where it's a ton of fun. And it's in many ways the AI dungeon I always dreamed of making. So we're super excited for it. It's been so much harder than we even thought it would be. I thought we would be able to make this kind of thing a few years ago, but it's taken us, we did several prototypes and then we've been developing it for the last 2 years. And there's just so much that goes into getting all these systems together. But as it started coming together, it's been really cool to see.
That's awesome, Nick. I cannot wait for you to hurry up and finish it because I want to play it. It's always great to talk to you too. I think we use most of our time, but I think we only scratched the surface on a number of topics that I would love to have dived into more. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and hope that we can keep talking about this in the future.
Great chatting with both of you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick.